Pretty good. If I come on, absolutely, listen to me.
Good evening, everyone. The University Lecture Series is a student-sponsored speaking program, and it's hosted many people at USF over the years. Its goal is to develop intellectual potential and present interesting and relevant information on a variety of scholastic and community-oriented issues. ULS will enhance the quality of student life in USF's learning environment, and I think tonight the lecture definitely meets that vision statement. The Alliance of Concerned Students, Peace Action Exchange, Tampa Food Not Bombs, and the USF Honors College has worked hard to bring you Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn has been one of the most important influences in our views of the world, especially in the realm of history. He speaks of a history through the people's eyes, not the eyes of the elite ivory tower historian or the so-called makers of history. He has published many essays and books, his most famous and important being A People's History of the United States. I hope that Dr. Zinn's discussion is really taken to heart tonight by everyone here, and that by the end of the night you may be rethinking the entire concept of history. And I hope that all of us can look at Dr. Zinn as an example of what it takes to enact change. We should all leave this lecture hall willing to speak out against what we abhor and speak up against what we desire, for what we desire. And I hope all of us truly realize that real change doesn't happen in government offices or university ivory towers or anywhere over there, but in the streets and in here. Now I'd like to welcome a World War II veteran, historian, writer, activist, and inspiration in my life, Dr. Howard Zinn.
Thank you, Anthony Schmidt. I thought for a minute my illegitimate son had shown up. No, I thank you for inviting me to USF. Never been here before, and I may never be here again. I'm invited to a lot of places. The real trick is when you're invited back. So it's a test of me, a test of you. So let me start by sort of trying to explain how I came to my peculiar point of view about history. By peculiar point of view, I mean that from the beginning, when I entered the field of history, when I decided to study history, decided to teach, and decided to write history, I did not think of it as a profession. That is, I didn't think that this is what I wanted to do to become a sort of a famous professional historian and to write articles for professional journals, and what to go to annual meetings of the American Historical Association, as exciting as they are. That was not my intent. From the beginning, I sort of saw going into history as a way, to put it very modestly, as a way of changing the world. I wanted not to just be an observer of history, but I wanted to be a participant in history. And I guess I came to this point of view, well, out of my own experience, out of my own life. I I grew up in a working class community in New York, and at the age of 18, I did not go to college. In my neighborhood and in my community, kids did not go to college at the age of 18. They went to work. So I went to work. I went to work in a shipyard, and I worked in a shipyard for 3 years. And I think it's fair to say that I developed a kind of a class consciousness. That's a phrase that's not used very often in the United States. In fact, it makes people nervous. You will hear presidential candidates commenting on one another and sort of saying, well, he is exciting class hatred. That means that the other candidate has suggested a slight rise in the minimum wage. We'll say, class hatred. Well, there's always been a pretense in this country that we're all one big happy family, that we all have the same interests, Exxon and me. No. Bush and you, you see. No, really, the idea is, yeah, we're and if anybody says anything that might suggest that we're not united, is an immediate sort of jumping on this idea. No, we mustn't be divided. We must all be united. Which means, when somebody says that, they really want you to be united around their idea and around their action and around what they do. So we have these. The language that we have is a language which is intended to bind us all together, pretending that we have a common interest. And so we have phrases like national unity, or national interest, national defense, national security. And you don't have people asking, well, what do you mean by national security? Whose security? No. And very often they will defend the people on high, the people who hold power. They will defend what they do by saying it's in the interests of national security. And that's supposed to stifle all ensuing discussion. Once you say it's for national security. I remember when Nixon was having his deep troubles about the Watergate scandal, and he was really in trouble, and he was in danger of being impeached and so on, and he had these conversations with his henchman. President, you would think, doesn't have henchmen. Only a mob leader has henchmen. No, that's not true. A president has henchmen, sometimes henchwomen. But Nixon had his henchmen, and after the tapes, remember, he didn't know, or he forgot that he was being taped, and then the tapes emerged, and then the tapes show Nixon talking to one of his henchmen and saying, and the henchman is saying, but how are we going to explain this? And Nixon says, we'll just say it's for national security. That stops everything. Well, there's no such thing as national security. There's their security and my security. There's the Pentagon security, and then there's the GI's security. There's the rich security and the poor security. It's a country with different interests, and it's important to recognize that, because if you don't recognize that, you'll be swallowed up in something called a common interest, which is not your interest at all. You'll be dragooned into a war which they say is for national defense, and it's not for your defense at all. So you have to resist being drawn into these, what Kurt Vonnegut, if any of you read Kurt Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle, wonderful book. I advise all of you to read it immediately. Kurt Vonnegut invents the word granfalloon. And granfalloon is something that envelops people in an artificial way, and puts people together, you see, in a way that they don't really belong together, but as a way really of controlling them. Well, I learned early that no, there is no such one interest that binds us all together. And if you look at the history of this country, that we have had conflicting interests from the beginning. The Constitution starts off with the words, "We, the people of the United States," established, and so on. It wasn't we, the people of the United States, who established the Constitution. It was 55 rich white men who got together in Philadelphia, and they framed, I know you're not supposed to say anything about the founding fathers. Really, it's interesting they consider our fathers like, we're part of the same family. We're not. No. Do you think this, the 20% of the population who were black slaves considered them the fathers? They fashioned a constitution which legitimized slavery. They fashioned a constitution which served the interests of the merchants and the bankers and the bondholders and the Western expansionists. They didn't set up a government to serve everybody's interests. There was no national interest which they served. Right from the beginning, we were a divided country between rich and poor, landlord and tenant, slave owner and slave, expansionist and Indian, but there's an attempt to suppress all that. And because if you don't suppress all that, people will begin to think that they have an interest separate from the interest of the people in power. And that the poor have an interest separate from the interests of the rich. And if they think that, beware. Because then the people who feel they do have a common interest with one another will get together and act for that common interest. And it may be against the interest of the people who are in authority and who send us to war and who swallow up the wealth of the nation. So that's the way I began to think. You can see something was really deeply wrong with me. Yeah. It's interesting about this business of classes. I taught for many years at Boston University, and the issue of class always would come up in my class. Because I was always interested. I was always interested in who benefits from what. And in those discussions, and many of my students, in fact, I would say most of my students at Boston University were the sons and daughters of quite successful people, business people and professional people. It wasn't a state institution or city institution. It was a private institution with high tuition. And so naturally it drew people who came from fairly affluent families. And so there's always people in my class who said, well, in this country, if you work hard, you will make it. Really? I knew that wasn't true growing up. I saw how hard my father worked. I saw how hard my mother worked. And my father certainly didn't become prosperous or make it in the American sense. And on the other hand, I saw people who made it, who, yes, prosperous. And then I couldn't figure out what kind of work they did. Couldn't figure out if they did any work at all. And sometimes when I found out what kind of work they did, it turned out that work was dangerous to everybody else. So very early on, I discarded the idea that, if you work hard, you will make it, that there was a necessary relationship between how hard you work and how rich and successful you become. And so I would have discussions like that in my class, and it soon, I think, became quite clear that you are becoming rich and successful in a capitalist society did not really depend on how hard you worked, didn't depend on how intelligent you were, certainly didn't depend on what contribution you made to society. Because there are all these people around, and we know who they are, people who make real contributions to society. nurses and janitors and teachers and social workers, and they're people who do the fundamental work of that keeps the society going, and they're the people with the lowest wages in the system. That's what I mean by class consciousness. And so when I began to write history and to teach history, that entered very strongly into my teaching and into my writing. I wasn't going to tell the story of the great American economic miracle of that period between the Civil War and World War I, when the United States became a great industrial power. And I remember sitting there in high school and thinking proudly how the United States had become number one. It's interesting how people are expected, people who themselves are not number one, are expected to revel in the fact that the country is considered number one because the country as a whole is very rich, which means some people at the top are very rich. But you're not part of that. But you're supposed to be revel in that. And we, sitting in high school class, are supposed to revel in that. Well, I wasn't going to teach that way. I wasn't going to teach that, oh, let's be proud that we had Rockefeller and Carnegie and the railroad magnates and they built up this country. No. I was interested in what was not given to me in my textbooks and in my lectures. I was interested, who are the people who worked on these railroads? What happened to the Chinese and Irish immigrants who worked on the Transcontinental Railroad when they taught me in school about this magnificent episode of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad? They didn't tell me about the thousands of working people, Chinese and Irish immigrants, who worked long hours on the railroad and who died in great numbers out of sickness and overwork. They didn't, they would teach me about Jacksonian democracy. I remember that was a big phrase in history courses, Jacksonian democracy. Didn't tell me that part of Jacksonian democracy was girls going to work in the 1830s in the textile mills of New England, going to work at the age of 10 and 12 and dying at the age of 25. That's a story I wanted to tell. I want to tell a story about who worked in Rockefeller's oil refineries, who worked in Carnegie's steel mills. What was the human cost of the building up of this great industrial giant? Yeah. So today, even today, when you hear say, well, our gross national product has reached 7 billion. Wait a while. Whose gross national product? Well, how gross is this national product? Who's benefiting from all of this? When they talk about economic growth, they say, oh, our growth has gone up from 3% to 4%. Oh, wait a while. Has my growth gone up? Has the waiter in the restaurant or the nurse in the hospital, has their income gone up with economic growth? Have to be very careful about these grand balloons. Have to be very careful about these large ways of encompassing everybody into one common interest, and so they'll all be happy and exult when some statistic shows us as being number one. In fact, the United States, is number one in many ways in economic indicators. It also happens to be among industrial nations number 16 in taking care of little kids so that they won't die before the age of 5. There's 15 countries ahead of us in having better, rates of infant mortality than the United States. I left the working in the shipyard to volunteer for the Air Force, and I became a bombardier in the United States Air Force. You may suspect that I'm taking you through my life year by year. I'll skip a few years, but I was in the Air Force in World War II. I have to tell you that, otherwise you might think it was the Spanish-American War. I volunteered. I was an eager bombardier. I flew bombing missions over Europe. And this was, as you probably know, the good war. the good war. It's the war that is used over and over again to show that war is okay. Really. This is what I resent most about World War II. That its goodness, whatever goodness it had, and that's complicated, but there was a sign of moral core to World War II, fighting against Hitler and fascism, yes. That moral core, that atmosphere of goodness around World War II has been used by every political leader since then to cast the same moral glow on all the ugly wars we have fought since then. They always love to use World War II as a metaphor for the war that we are currently engaged in. And so when it was suggested that we shouldn't be in Vietnam, people say, what? We're going to have another Munich? We're going to have another surrender like we had in World War II? Interesting. Yeah. In fact, the dictator of South Vietnam, who was our buddy, was called at one time by President Lyndon Johnson the Winston Churchill of Southeast Asia. That was a bit of a stretch. But if you notice, every enemy becomes a Hitler. Every country that we make war on becomes, another, World War II situation. And World War II was morally complex. It wasn't simply the good war. But it wasn't until after the war that I began to question the things that happened in World War II. And when I say the things that happened in World War II, I mean, yes, they were the bad guys, we were the good guys. They were no question about it. They were the worst, the fascists. But there's a logical jump that people make very often, which is unwarranted. And the logical jump is this. If they are the bad guys, then we must be the good guys. No, not necessarily. They can be the bad guys, and we can be bad. Maybe not as bad as them, or sometimes just as bad, or sometimes worse. But it doesn't follow that because the enemy is bad, that you are therefore good. Because it leads to terrible things happening in war. But what happens then is you decide that because they're the bad guys, one, you're the good guys. And if they're the bad guys and you're the good guys, it means you can do anything you want without questioning it. Once you've decided they're the bad guys, you can drop bombs on their civilians. You can kill 60,000 people in one night in Dresden, 30,000 in one night in Frankfurt and Hamburg. You can drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and kill 200,000 people, and it doesn't matter because you're the good guys. Because you don't question, once you've decided you're the good guys, nothing can be questioned. And you can fly over Tokyo in the spring of 1945 and set Tokyo afire, and in one night, 100,000 people die in Tokyo. Well, that's what happens when you succumb to this logic that they're bad, therefore we're good and we can do whatever we want, and whatever we do is okay. And I bought that. I didn't question the things we did. I didn't question the bombing raids that I was on. It wasn't until after the war that I thought back to the last bombing raid I was on, a few weeks before the end of World War II. Actually, we didn't know we were going to have another bombing raid. There was no reason to have another bombing raid. The war was almost over. Everybody knew it was going to be over in a matter of weeks. And then suddenly we're awakened in the middle of the night to go out and get ready to bomb somewhere. Where? The intelligence people explained it to us. Intelligence people can explain things. They are really good. Yes. I don't know where they got that name. But intelligence people, and they explained to us that although we had long overrun France, we were going to bomb a little town in France, on the Atlantic coast of France. Our armies had gone all through France. We're into Germany. The war was almost over. Well, we were going to bomb a little town on the Atlantic coast of France. Why? Because there were several thousand Germans hanging out there. They'd been overrun. They were waiting for the war to end. They weren't bothering anybody, but they were there. And we had all these planes. And we had all these bombs. And we had all these flyers. And we had all these medals to be won. So yeah, let's bomb them. Because they didn't say that. They didn't say that to us in the briefing. They didn't say that's why we're bombing them. They don't have to say why. They just tell you this is what you're going to do. And we, idiots that we usually are, when the military can make idiots of you. I'm serious about that. I don't mean to insult people in the military. I'm talking about myself. I mean, the military can put you in a situation where you just don't question what you're doing. You just listen for your next orders and say, I'm in the military, I'm a soldier, I follow orders. No. And so we sent 1,200, I was one, in one of the planes, 1,200 heavy bombers over this tiny town on the Atlantic coast of France to bomb several thousand German soldiers, which we did with a new kind of bomb, what they called jellied gasoline, was actually napalm, first use of napalm in the European theater. Yeah, and we destroyed the town, killed who knows how many Germans, who knows how many French. It was a victory. I didn't think about that until after the war. One of the things that happens in wartime is very often you don't know what you're doing. Death is dealt out at long distance. Pilots who are way up there drop bombs, and like me, flying up there at 30,000 feet, I didn't see anybody. I didn't see any human beings. I didn't hear any screams. I didn't see any blood. I didn't see kids with their limbs torn off, but that's what was happening below, and I didn't know it. And this happens in modern warfare. You fire shells, you fire rockets, you blast away at a house, you drop a bomb on an automobile, being very proud that you were precise. But the truth is you don't know who's in that automobile. You don't know who's in that house. You don't know who you're killing. That's the nature of bombing. Next time you read in the papers about precision bombs and smart bombs, don't believe it. Bombing is by its nature a very, very uncertain kind of operation, and it results in indiscriminate death to men, women, children, whoever happens to be in the vicinity of your bomb. I didn't think about that until after the war. I read John Hersey's book on Hiroshima. John Hersey was a journalist who traveled to Hiroshima right after the bombing, and he talked to survivors, with people who were still alive. But you can imagine what those people who were still alive looked like. They were people without limbs. They were people who were blinded. They were people with skin that you couldn't bear to look at. Those are the people he talked to, and he told their stories. And when I read what he wrote, for the first time, it came to me what happens when you drop bombs on people. The reason I'm telling you this is not for history, because I'm not interested in history as past. The reason I'm telling you this is that when you read, we're bombing Fallujah, we're bombing this place, we're bombing, and the newspapers don't give you a real picture of what is happening to human beings in Fallujah, in Basra, in these other, you are being misled. You are being led to think, oh, this is a nice military operation, maybe a few casualties here and there. Sorry, a mistake. I don't know how many times I heard Rumsfeld say, sorry, well, it was a radar miscalculation or intelligent misbriefing, or no. They're not accidents. I don't mean that they're deliberate. The pilot doesn't deliberately decide to kill a child. No, but it's not an accident. It's not deliberate. It's an inevitability. You're participating in an inevitability. And if you don't know that, you're innocent. You're naive. But I began to think about that when, for the first time, I understood, reading about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what happens to human beings when they're being bombed. So I came out of the war, came out of World War II. I came out of the good war, skeptical about war. Yes, we had defeated Hitler, we had accomplished certain things, but there was a cost. 50 million people died in World War II. There was a cost, a human cost, which simply couldn't be ignored. And there were things that our side did, which were atrocities. Just as on Hitler's side there were atrocities, there were things that we did that were atrocities. And I came to the conclusion that war corrupts everybody who engages in it. I had a student once who wrote a paper about war, and she said, wars are like wines, good years and bad years, good wars and bad wars. She said, but war is not like wine. War is like cyanide. One drop and you're dead. I came to believe that war, whatever immediate satisfaction you may get from it, whatever immediate tyrant you have overthrown, whatever immediate gratification you've gotten in a war which leaves you victorious, that war solves no fundamental problems. And if there is, if there was any challenge, real challenge before the human race today, it is a challenge of how to deal with tyranny, with aggression, with the various problems that there are in the world, how to deal with these problems without killing huge numbers of people. That is, without war. War does not solve these problems. They come back at you. They're gone for a few years and they come back. The tyrant is gone and another tyrant appears. The war against fascism defeats fascism, and then you look around. I looked around at the world after the war. A world which had been promised to me would be better and different. I remember this letter I got when I was discharged from the Air Force, letter from General Marshall, personal letter, of course. Only addressed to about 16 million men. And what I said, congratulations, thank you for your service. This will be a different world. It wasn't. It hasn't been. We got rid of Hitler and Mussolini. We did not get rid of fascism in the world. We did not get rid of militarism in the world. How could we? We had two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, each in possession of thousands of nuclear weapons, which if used, and they came close at times to being used, if used, would make Hitler's Holocaust look puny. Militarism was not done with. Racism was not done with in the world. Exploitation not done with. So, I came to certain ideas about war, which made me anti-war from that point on. War corrupts everybody who engages in it. And you can see that in what's happening to our soldiers. You take young, decent guys, you put them in a war situation, and they will torture people. They will kill innocent people, really. This is true all over the world. You put people, and who puts them there? The political leaders put these guys. Can't blame these guys who are put into this situation, or these women put into this situation. And they are corrupted, because war You corrupt somebody as soon as you give them weapons and weapons and weapons, tell them this is the enemy and this is what you have to do. War corrupts everybody who engages in it. When you make war against a tyrant, you want to do something about a tyrant. You want to get rid of a tyrant. You want to get rid of Saddam Hussein. When you make war against a tyrant, the people you kill are the victims of the tyrant. Really. You make war against Saddam Hussein, and who are the people who die? The ordinary people of Iraq. That's important to think about. When somebody explains to you, oh, we've got to go to war because we've got to get rid of this tyrant. Wait a while, who are you going to kill in the process? Here's another thing about war. It's about means and ends. The means of war, everybody agrees, are horrible. Because even militarists, generals, everybody, they all agree war is hell. They all agree to that. The means of war are atrocious. The ends of war are uncertain. No matter what you're told we have to use these horrible means in order to accomplish these good ends. Oh, we have to bomb all these places in Iraq. We have to kill tens of thousands of Iraqis in order to bring democracy and liberty to Iraq, you see. But the truth is, and they say, well, this is bad, but the end will be good. You don't know that. When you start a war, you don't know what the end is going to be. So you're dealing with a situation where you have certain horrible means and uncertain ends. That means that war is not acceptable morally as a solution for human problems. So this gives you another thing, as if I haven't said enough about war. It seems to be on my mind. But one of the things to think about is that the victims of war, even though your country possesses enormous military hardware. I mean, when you think about it, there's something pitiful about the United States, a country of 270 million people with 10,000 nuclear weapons, with an enormous air force, an enormous navy, visiting destruction on a country of 25 million people, which is barely out of the, agricultural age. Something pitiful about that. But one of the things that you might consider is that the victims of war are not just on their side, and they're not just the ones that appear in the headlines on our side, but the victims of war on our side will not be known for quite a while. Because we do not know the psychic costs that are being paid by the 100,000 soldiers in Iraq, what is happening to their minds when they come back from the war. We've had that experience with Vietnam, with soldiers coming back. Do you know how many Vietnam veterans committed suicide in the years following the Vietnam War? Do you know that the number of suicides of Vietnam veterans in the decades following the Vietnam War exceeded the number of American soldiers killed in Vietnam? That's a startling statistic. The casualties of war come year after year after year. In the Gulf War, there was a first Gulf War, 1991, there was a kind of pride. Oh, wow, we won this war very fast, a 6-week war, and with only a few hundred casualties. But in the years that followed, 6,000 veterans of the first Gulf War died for various reasons of sickness. 200,000 of the 600,000 who served in the first Gulf War in Iraq, 200,000 of the 600,000, when they got back, filed for disability, saying that they had suffered in some way from the war, whether physically or mentally. And of those 200,000, 150,000 were accepted as legitimate. So we cannot calculate the costs of war immediately during the war or immediately right after the war. They will be with us for a long time. When I got out of the Air Force, did I tell you I'd take you year by year through my life? Let's see. Always look at my watch to pretend that I care. I was married. We had a couple of kids. I say that very casually. I think it was 2 kids. I knocked around in various jobs, then I decided to go to college under the GI Bill. At the age of 27, I became a freshman in college. That should encourage many of you. Don't rush. Take your time. Do other things. You know, take a break. There's a lot of education that takes place out there in the world that you can't get in the classroom. My first teaching job was at Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, black women's college. Went there in 1956 and stayed there for 7 years. My family and I lived in the black community for 7 years and became involved in the movement. Those were the years of the movement, and became very much involved in the movement. And I'm telling you about this not because I want to go into that very rich experience, one of the most intense experiences of my life, because I became a kind of participant writer about the movement, and I went from Atlanta to Albany, Georgia, to Selma, Alabama, to various towns in Mississippi, and worked with a student nonviolent coordinating committee, and wrote about what I saw, but I don't want to go into that, as I say, very rich story. But I want to say what I learned mostly. What I learned mostly from being in that movement was that you should never think you have been defeated by the forces of war and wealth and power and privilege, no matter how it seems at any moment. The social movements, and I say this on the basis of not only being involved in the civil rights movement, but studying social movements in American history, movements have a trajectory. And then at almost every point in that trajectory, they look helpless. They look as if they're not accomplishing anything. There's this great power. Can you imagine how helpless black people in the South felt in the 1950s? Atlanta, Georgia was as tightly segregated as Johannesburg, South Africa. The white people, not all the white people, but the important white people, held all governmental posts. They were all the policemen, they were all the sheriffs, they were all the mayors, they were all the governors, all the members of the state legislatures. And the federal government was not helping the cause of racial equality, no matter what people try to say to make Kennedy and Johnson heroes. They were not heroes of the movement. They came late into the picture. Because what happened is that these supposedly helpless black people in the South began to resist, began to protest, began sit-ins and freedom rides and demonstrations and occupations and marches and parades, and the movement grew and grew and grew until the power of the southern states could not prevail against them. And the neutrality of the federal government had to fall away, and excitement was created in the nation and in the world, and an atmosphere was created in which the South began to change. Important things happened. That's what I learned, that democracy, we all learn about democracy, we learn about it in school, we learned that we're a democracy. Maybe, sort of. We're better than a totalitarian state, we're better than a monarchy, but that doesn't mean, just like I said before, because that's all bad doesn't mean we're all good. You learn about democracy in school. I remember the teacher putting democracy on the blackboard. Can you imagine putting democracy? Here are the three branches of government: executive, legislative, judicial. This is how the government works. This is how democracy works. That's a very neat way of presenting democracy. That means your only job as a citizen is to go to the polls every several years and choose between two well-off white men of moderate or reactionary bent. That's your job as a citizen. The rest of the time, leave it to them, leave it to the branches of government. That's not how social change comes about. I learned that democracy only comes alive when citizens, ordinary people, black people in the South, women who rise up in the 60s and 70s, people all over the country who create a movement against the war in Vietnam. Democracy only comes alive when ordinary people begin to organize and act and persist and take risks and have faith that even though they don't succeed today or this week or next month or next year, that if they persist, something is bound to happen. That's what I learned from my experience in the South. Something that I want to keep with me and pass on, because we all face that. I think today we all face a certain sense of helplessness in the face of a war which goes on, and a war machine which seems to be impenetrable, and a government which is taking the wealth of the country and pouring it into war, while health and education and the rights of children and even veterans' rights are not being funded. It's a grim situation. But there are huge numbers of people in this country who don't believe in that. Huge numbers of people in this country who understand that we need to be different in the world. We need to be different at home. We need to be different in the world. Understand that we cannot be a militaristic, marauding country deciding that we are going to send our armies wherever we feel like all over the world to give people freedom and democracy, which is, of course, we're not going to do. What history tells us about, and I'm now talking about American history, that's throughout American history, with all the claims that we are going here and there to bring democracy to the Mexicans, to the Spaniards, to the Filipinos, to the people in Central America, through all of that has been one underlying motive. Motive is expansion, imperial expansion, building an empire. Motive is economic to a great extent. The oil, tin, and rubber of Southeast Asia behind the war in Vietnam. Tin and copper behind our covert operations to overthrow a democratic government in Chile. Sugar to explain the United Fruit lands, to explain why we overthrew a democratically elected government in Guatemala. And now oil to explain why we're in Iraq. Not Saddam Hussein, not weapons of mass destruction, not creating democracy, oil. There's a history of our relations with the Middle East, and the history of our relations in the Middle East from World War II on center on oil. So we have a lot of work to do in this country to build a citizens' movement, one that will combine the energies of the civil rights movement and the labor movement and the anti-war movement, and understand that change will not come because we elect one guy over another. One guy may be a little better than the other, but basically that's not what is going to bring about important change? Well, bring about important change is a movement of ourselves, which will then act upon whoever is in the White House. Whoever sits in Congress at a certain point, they will have to take cognizance of what is happening in the country and respond to it. So there's, as I say, there's work for us to do. That's why I came here, to tell you what your job is. Thank you. I'm finished. In more ways than one. And we have a question period.
Hi, many of the European leaders have attributed the terrorist attacks because the U.S. unilateral stance on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. What's your take on this, briefly?
Briefly. New York State asked me to answer briefly. European leaders, some of the European leaders that you're saying that that's terrorism. One of the important causes of terrorism is the United States stance on Israel, right? Yeah, I don't doubt it. What is missed in the discussion of the war on terrorism, what is not supposed to be discussed is the question of how much American foreign policy has contributed to terrorism. It's as if the terrorists are just wild, crazy, they have no agenda, they don't care about anything, they just want to kill people. Well, they are fanatics. Every movement has its fanatics who will carry the grievances of that movement to extremes. Situation we have is that there are millions of people in the Islamic world who have been angry at the United States. Millions of people in the Middle East who have been angry at America's foreign policy. They've been angry at the fact that we have had troops stationed in the Middle East, all over the Middle East. They've been angry at the fact that we have supported Arab dictatorships in the Middle East. They've been angry at the fact that we have supported Israel in its insistence on holding on to the occupied territories. They were angry at the fact that we maintained sanctions against Iraq, which resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi kids, really. The things that that people in the Arab world had grievances against the United States, and legitimate grievances. So when you have millions of people with all such grievances, out of those millions are going to come a small number of fanatics who will decide that the way to deal with those grievances is by carrying out some active violence of terrorism. And so what do you have to do? What do you have to do? Well, what Bush administration decided to do, well, the best way to deal with terrorism is by terrorism. I'm serious. War is terrorism. Make no mistake about it. War is terrorism. Nations are more capable of killing more people with terrorism than terrorist bands and terrorist individuals can do. But neither the Bush administration nor Kerry is a candidate, neither of the two major parties, and nobody prominent in that political life has questioned the war on terrorism. In fact, Kerry said, "Oh, I'll just wage the war on terrorism better than Bush." Not asking the question, what do you mean by a war on terrorism? If the problem is American foreign policy, then you can't just deal with terrorism by going and bombing this country and bombing that country and thinking that you are doing something about terrorism. No, in fact, you're increasing the number of terrorists in the world. You're making more people angry at you. I mean, this is not, that you're a radical historian and we're talking. I'm really repeating the idea of a man who was with the CIA for many, many years, and wrote a book just recently called Imperial Hubris, in which he says the United States, by its actions in the Middle East, has caused terrorism to grow. So, yes, the answer to your question briefly is yes, that's certainly one of the elements. But nobody wants to discuss, nobody in high places wants to discuss American foreign policy. Because in order to discuss that, they would have to say, oh, we have to make fundamental change in American foreign policy. We have to withdraw our troops from other countries. We have to stop being the military superpower of the world. No, we have to start being a humanitarian superpower. That's it.
I want to thank you very much for coming, for one thing. For another, for giving us some hope with your talk about the trajectory as it relates to movements, and that we, still must be hopeful and continue our work. I would like you to comment, if you would, on the contrast between the United States, 48% of us who did not vote for the installed president, with the people in Kiev, who have been now for 8.5 days on the streets demonstrating, and compare also the what you think the response of our government would be if we went on the streets with the government of Kiev, which has said that they will not use violence against their citizens. And how do we get from where we are to where they are in the Ukraine?
Well, I guess we learned something from Ukraine. I mean, that's when people are angry about the election. They feel the election has been fixed, so they come out into the streets by the hundreds of thousands. And it's been relatively non-violent. They haven't killed people, but they've shown the power of the people. And in doing that, they have a good chance of perhaps the change. That's all I can say about that. Yes.
Dr. Zinn, I am a teacher here in Hillsborough County at the high school level, and I teach U.S. government and comparative politics. My interest, I would like to break as much as I can with that tradition of socializing the next generation of passive citizens. And I can see even that something. Even at age 17, many of my students already have that passive political nature ingrained in them. What can I as an educator do to break that passiveness without causing them to become reactionary at the same time?
How do you change the passivity of students and awaken them? One way is inside the classroom, and another way is outside the classroom. As inside the classroom, I think it's a matter of teaching the history of social movements and of giving them different kinds of heroes than the kind of heroes that they usually get. Instead of having Theodore Roosevelt as a hero, the great military man, the man who rode up San Juan Hill in the Spanish-American War, and who was up there on Mount Rushmore, immovable. Instead of Theodore Roosevelt, well, let's give them as a hero Helen Keller, who spoke out against war, who was an activist, even though she obviously couldn't speak or hear or see, and she was an activist, and she joined the anti-war movement in World War I. Or give them the example of, show them films about the civil rights movement, show them Eyes on Pride, that excite and inspire them by giving them examples in the classroom of people in history who have overcome that passivity and who, as a result of doing that, have felt better about themselves. have felt that they were contributing something to the world and to themselves, to their own lives. And then take them outside the classroom or encourage them to go outside the classroom to get involved in what is happening in the community. And I was teaching a course called Law and Justice in America. The big assignment for my students was not a take a line with them. The big assignment was go out into the community, find an organization that's doing something that you believe in. You can't find an organization that's doing something we believe in. Start an organization that's doing something we believe in.
I wanted to ask you, when you started talking about class consciousness, a nation and a people came to my mind. And then when you start talking about war, same nation and same people came to my mind. One of the reasons I wasn't here, and it was because I thought that maybe we'd be able to have some consideration of this nation that has consisted of blockade for almost 50 years. And maybe there would be a possibility that students would be able to go and really see what this nation is about and have exchange with these people in this country. Do you feel that now with what happened, with President Bush winning, and how do you feel? What's going to happen to Cuba? What's going to happen to the Cuban people? Do you see any possibilities that we're going to respect them for everything that they have done as far as caring for humanity? Not only in Cuba, but around the world. Maybe are we further away? Is there a possibility? Anyone? Thank you.
Talk about ridiculous policy. Cuba, great threat to the United States. It's absurd. We cannot get over the fact, by we, I mean the government. I always associate myself with the government. This shows how unconsciously I become part of the grand balloon. Now, the government cannot get over the fact that Cuba had a revolution and overthrew a dictator that the United States had supported for decades. And suddenly, when Cubans have a revolution, and then suddenly they become the worst. And I've heard both Clinton and Bush say this, the worst human rights record in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America. Absolutely untrue. I mean, there are human rights problems in Cuba. There are political prisoners in Cuba. But it's absurd. And I've been to Cuba, and it's absurd to compare Cuba with the death squad governments of El Salvador that we supported, or what happened in Guatemala, where several 100,000 people were killed by a government that we supported. But we resent the fact that Castro will not knuckle into the United States. That's what we resent in countries all over the world. We will go along with dictators, with tyrants, with abuses of human rights, just so long as that government does what we want it to do. And we did that for years all over the world. But if there's a government that refuses to go along with us, Castro is that kind of an independent guy. And the government cannot tolerate that. And so it has the blockade, which is hurting the Cuban people, really hurting them. I mean, here are people who have a healthcare with all their meager resources. They have a healthcare system which is in many ways superior to the healthcare system of the United States. That is some of the best medical training in the world. They have free healthcare for everybody in Cuba. And so they're not a good example for the United States government. And we don't want examples like that. So will it change? It has to. There's some things that happen. When policy is so stupid, it can go on and on and on, but at some point it's going to change. I mean, business people in the United States are going to start demanding trade with Cuba, and more people in the United States are going to be wanting to go to Cuba. And at some point, yes, I think policy will change. I don't know when. But it's very important for the American people to be educated about what is happening there, what our policy is, and how cruel that policy is, depriving people on this little island who don't have that many resources, but depriving them of basic necessities, this huge colossus of the north, so choking Cuba and hoping that it will die. I don't think it will.
I'm a member of several groups of citizen activists and several movements. And what I see now, it concerns me, and I wonder if we can work on your trajectory if we're working at cross purposes. For example, the labor movement and living wage movement are working against the rights of immigrants and acceptance of immigrants, or environmental movements are sometimes working against increased density and affordable housing. There are many, many examples like this. And my concern is how do we don't have common interests with maybe the upper class and lower class, but what about among and within the lower classes and middle class?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. It's been true for a long time, but very often, the labor movement, for instance, for a long time in American history has opposed the rights of immigrants and gotten very head up about, we are the native born, they are the foreign born. Well, just as unions were angry at black people and kept black people out, and I mean, it's a terrible thing to see that people who should have a common interest will be in conflict, and I don't have the answer to that. Those are things that people have to work out in a way that that they require compromise. Environmentalists may have to compromise with people who need housing, and labor movements will at some point have to yield in some way to the rights of immigrants. Maybe one of the ways is by going outside the box of these two groups squaring off against one another, and for instance, helping workers who are displaced by immigrants by giving them economic aid to make up for what they lose in the competition with immigrants. But there are different ways that have to be found for compromises. Yeah.
Dr. Zinn, I am a teacher in Hillsborough County. I am a conservative, so I'm probably not popular here, or as a teacher in my school. But I also teach my kids it's very important that you experience both sides of the society if you don't agree with it. I have a question for you. I look back in history, I hear your arguments for anti-war, and I respect them. But I look back and I see men like Chamberlain who gave in to Hitler and saw the consequence. I see the UN who gave in to Saddam. You see the consequence. You see the Shiites who rose up in Iraq against him. You see the Kurds who rose up in Iraq against him, only to be slaughtered. My question as a conservative, and a lot of conservatives would say, at what point do you say enough is enough? When do we do something about it? He abused his oil for food program. There's examples like that. At what point do we say, okay, we tried the peaceful route, when do we go into war against something like that, even if we're going to be accused of going in for blood?
When they say enough is enough and you go to war, you want to do something about something that's wrong. But what I'm suggesting is that war is not the answer. And Iraq is a good example. Saddam Hussein is a tyrant. War was not the answer, Saddam Hussein.
Okay, then my question is, what is the answer? Your solutions were not working, in my opinion. So what would the answer be?
My solution. I'm sorry.
Your solution to the people rising up, economic sanctions against them.
Well, you must be impatient. Violence is the tactic of the impatient. Look, Donald, people want a quick fix. They want quick, you've got to do something about this. They turn to violence. And that doesn't fix things, that just makes things worse. And at times, we have to follow a slower, it's not that you ignore the problem. You have to follow a tactic which does not kill huge numbers of people. And I'll give you an example of South Africa. In South Africa, you talk about enough is enough. Is apartheid enough? Apartheid in South Africa was enough. And at some point, the African National Congress, which represented the black population, could have said, enough is enough. We're going to war. We're going to have bloody civil war in South Africa to overthrow the apartheid government. They decided against it. The African National Congress decided against that because they knew that, oh, well, we might win this bloody war and do away with apartheid, but in the course of it, a million of us, a million black people will be killed. Instead, they decided on eroding the power of the apartheid government year by year, decade by decade. And they used multiplicity of tactics, strikes, sabotage, economic pressure, international pressure. And it took years and years and years, but apartheid fell without war. I think that there is a tactic that can deal with problems where you say enough is enough. That tactic cannot be war. There are other tactics, there are other ways. It takes more time, more patience.
Dr. Zinn, W.E.B. Du Bois said that the problem of the 20th century is the color line, and indeed it still is today. And we even see this as a problem in social movements and organizing. And I would like for you to compare and contrast grassroots organizing along racial lines versus along class lines.
That sounds like a subject for a master's essay.
It's due tomorrow. Except it's not a master's essay.
Will you give me a quick note?
Absolutely.
The race and class are heavily intertwined. No way of separating them. And you know, the problem, you know, when Du Bois said the problem of the 20th century and the problem of the color line, and that was certainly true. It is also true, and this is the problem of the 21st century, there's the problem of the color line and also the problem of economic inequality. Class inequality and racial inequality, they both have to be fought at the same time. That's all I can say.
I find your assumption that we need to get more and more people involved in democracy questionable. I guess you could start with Plato's old critique of democracy, and he asks in the Republic, where's the rational check on what the people are going to do? I mean, there are many examples of history of people doing some really atrocious things with democracy, like when they got democracy after World War I, the Germans elected Hitler to power. But the thing that I'm really getting at is don't know what people are going to do with their choices. I mean, you just don't. Is there some sort of strategy you have to combat? Like, what are people going to do with democracy? Is basically my question.
No, I don't have such a strategy. And there is, yes, when people have power, when you have real democracy, might not work. Might have all sorts of problems. And when you don't have democracy, you have all sorts of problems. So if you have two situations where in one case you have problems, in the other case you have problems, I'll choose the democracy. Because at least it leaves the opening for continuing to solve those problems by more democracy. As you already are on the road to self-correcting whatever democracy fails to correct. I mean, what is the alternative? The alternative, Plato's chosen few, Plato's philosophy of kings.
Of course, that's idealist. Yeah. I'm just saying, what I'm asking is,
That's what we have now.
with democracy. I'm saying that there's a real issue to deal with.
No, I agree. It's not simple and it's not clear and it's not pure. And, but I think it's a process. It's a never-ending process.
I'm a 16-year-old high school student, and before I came here today, my grandma gave me a lecture on how I should support Bush simply because he's our president, and how any efforts I made didn't matter because I'm one person and millions of people in this country. What personal message would you give my grandma and as well as other people who try to break the spirits of people who want to provoke change?
This is what you tell your grandma. You might ask her if she is a patriotic person. I suspect she thinks she is. And then you might ask her if she thinks that patriotism means supporting your government no matter what it does. And if she says yes, then you say, well, then patriotism is what people do in a totalitarian state. And if you believe in democracy, as I think your grandmother, I assume your grandmother believes in democracy because she's your grandmother. And if you believe in democracy, then you cannot believe that you must obey whatever your government does. Because the government, here you might introduce your grandmother, although she may already know about it, the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence is our basic democratic philosophical document. The Declaration of Independence says that governments are artificial creations. Governments are set up for certain purposes. Governments are set up to ensure that people have an equal right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When governments fail to do that, then, according to the Declaration of Independence, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish the government. So, you know, at least if you look at the Declaration of Independence, it might give up law. I mean, who's against the Declaration of Independence? People aren't against it, they just ignore it. You see, and tell her that the most patriotic thing you can do is to support the principles for which the government goes to stand. And when the government goes against those principles, then the government deserves to be criticized and changed. That's the one.